you can't win. You can't win. I'm unstoppable force. Watch out, watch out. Here I come, here I come. There I am. Bam, bam. Eat it, eat it. That's right. Where's your other guy? Where's your other guy?
Right now, we have 5,000 of these drones in the air, 12,000 on the ground. If we take the growth trajectory up, as one Air Force Lieutenant General put it, we're reaching into the tens of thousands.
One of the reasons for the development of this technology has been to avoid disturbing the peace of mind of the American people. No casualties, invisibility, nice.
And precisely because it's accurate, it gives this illusion that it is also going to target the right people, but it doesn't.
It's this surgical precision, the ability with laser-like focus to eliminate the cancerous tumor called an al-Qaeda terrorist while limiting damage to the tissue around it. That makes this counterterrorism tool so essential.
As of March 2011, the U.S. Air Force had 48 Predator and Reaper combat air patrols, flying both in Iraq and Afghanistan. That compares with only 18 in 2007. As of March 2011, the Air Force was training more pilots for these unmanned aircraft than for any other single weapon system.
Why is it increased dramatically? Because the technology has evolved and developed to the point where it's able to be used at a large level and a large scale by not just special forces anymore, but by regularly trained Marines and soldiers. So we're not just talking the big UAVs that are flown out of Las Vegas. We're talking hand-launched UAVs that are launched from the backs of Humvees in Afghanistan by corporals in the Marine Corps. So that's how they've evolved. It's technology. It's like saying cell phone use has increased over the last 10 years. Why is that? Well, because technology has increased, they become cheaper, they become easier to use, and the ubiquity of them has just, it's there now.
There are over 60 bases across the globe which are engaging in drone warfare. Here in the United States, according to a U.S. Air Force report, there are, I would say, close to 100 bases in the United States which are engaging in drone warfare missions. At one point, we had seen Creech Air Force Base, just outside of Las Vegas, Nevada, being the epicenter of drone missions. That has since changed with the expansion of unmanned aerial vehicles in the United States.
U.S. drones are currently deployed in the skies of over 14 different countries, some for surveillance and others for attacking ground targets. The area of Pakistan bordering Afghanistan, known as Waziristan, is the locus of much of the drone operations. And it is in Pakistan that the use of this weapon has inflamed the population, posing a serious problem for U.S. policymakers.
This group of Pakistani protesters is shouting, "Shame on America." Their demonstration comes after a late-night drone attack killed 4 militants in the country's northwest tribal region.
So until 2006, there had been rather quiet in Afghanistan. Things had been quiet, but the U.S. had failed to establish any kind of a working system, NATO and the U.S. So people over there, they needed some kind of basic justice, basic administration. So there was an absence of any kind of government. So they started seeking alternatives, and the alternative was being provided by the Taliban, who were there, who had a much more efficient, you can say, system of justice. They were able to deliver in a short period of time, and secondly, it was also available to everyone as opposed to the central government, whose justice was mostly available to those who had means. So what happens is that a shadow government started being established, but the shadow government had its it did have a central command, and these commands were based in North Waziristan and in Quetta. So at one point, the U.S., when it realized that it's losing its grip on the situation, so they started targeting inside Pakistan. Initially, it was very sporadic. In fact, the first year there was just one in 2004, one drone strike, and it was considered so embarrassing by the Pakistani government that they admitted to having carried out the attack rather than let it be known that their sovereignty had been breached. And next year again, there were very few. 2006, 2007, very few drone attacks. The spike came early in 2008, and it came in response to the US presidential campaign, during which Barack Obama was attacking George Bush as being too soft in Afghanistan. And in order to take the heat off himself, Bush escalated the drones program. Nevertheless, there was still, it was kept within limits, and also there was another barrier too, which was, which I shouldn't say a barrier, but nevertheless, as long as Pervez Musharraf, the Pakistani military leader, was still in power, so he maintained some degree of a check on how much the US could do. As soon as he stepped down, so suddenly there was this immense spike in the number of drone attacks. So until then there had been about 17, and since then there have been more than 240. So what happened is that as soon as Musharraf steps down in August 2008, there is an intense escalation of the drone attacks. And still, they were not nearly as frequent as they have been under Barack Obama. Because as soon as Bush was gone, suddenly the number of strikes, in fact, right on his third day in office, Barack Obama launched his first drone strike. And these drone strikes have been escalating ever since, to the extent that now there's one every 4 days.
What's going on in Waziristan is there's a war going on up there, and it's an undeclared, totally illegal one, much like Cambodia back in the Vietnam era. And the CIA, while they won't admit it publicly, are flying drones over people's heads all day long, and then unleashing Hellfire missiles at them at $60,000 a pop. These things fire down and create awful carnage below. What this is doing to the people of Waziristan is terrorizing everybody, friend and foe alike, and there are a lot more people there who should be our friends than there are people who are our enemies. But if you can imagine having these things flying overhead all day long, then I think you get a little sense of what my mother had in World War II in Britain, when she had doodlebugs flying over and being fired at her. And she speaks to me today. She's 84 years old. She still tells me of the terror of those things, and I'm afraid that's what we're doing in Waziristan right now.
There is, of course, no such thing as a perfect weapon, and remotely piloted aircraft are no exception. As the President and others have acknowledged, there have indeed been instances when, despite the extraordinary precautions we take, civilians have been accidentally killed, or worse, have been accidentally injured, or worse, killed in these strikes. It is exceedingly rare, but it has happened. When it does, it pains us, and we regret it deeply, as we do any time innocents are killed in war.
In order to find their targets, the U.S. initially relied on human intelligence. They would have informers on the ground, and it was as unreliable as it is. It was still better than what they have been doing since then. Because now what they do is that they have drones which just hover over the region for some time. They use something called pattern of life intelligence. So let's say that they see somebody, they have bombed a compound. I shouldn't use the word compound because that is what they call homes. So they have bombed a home of what they suspect to be a militant. Now what they do is that the drone hovers over it, and it watches who comes to rescue. And whoever comes there, or whoever comes to for assistance. So then they start monitoring them, then they start following them around, and then they chase them back to their homes. They look at who they are meeting. So essentially, without actually knowing anything about them, hovering over the air, so they try to determine who might be a militant, and then they kill them, then they bomb them.
I think the most important thing for anyone to make a decision, whether it be you and me or whether it be President Obama, is that they know the truth. And if the CIA is saying that these are precision strikes that cause no, quote, collateral damage, that's just false. And what we need is the reality. So, for example, we collected up 7 pieces of drone missiles that had been fired at folk, and we can actually attach these pieces to particular deaths. So, for example, in August 23rd, 2010, there's a piece of missile that we have that killed a small child that we have a photograph of his dead body. What that does is, I think, bring home in a very real way, certainly to me, and I hope to the American people, what's going on in Waziristan, and it's not what the government says, unfortunately.
This is the seriousness, the extraordinary care that President Obama and those of us on his national security team bring to this weightiest of questions: whether to pursue lethal force against a terrorist who is plotting to attack our country. When that person is a U.S. citizen, we ask ourselves additional questions. Attorney General Holder has already described the legal authorities that clearly allow us to use lethal force against an American citizen who is a senior operational leader of Al-Qaeda. He has discussed the thorough and careful review, including all relevant constitutional considerations, that is to be undertaken by the U.S. government when determining whether the individual poses an imminent threat of violent attack against the United States.
Yes, the Obama, who has been targeting terrorists in Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia, even killing U.S. citizens, has just authorized an expansion of bombing raids wherever there is suspicious behavior at sites known to be controlled by a terrorist group. These are illegal. The drone attacks have been illegal all along. The assassinations of anyone have been illegal because under the Geneva Conventions, and the United States is a party to the Geneva Conventions, targeted or political assassinations, sometimes called extrajudicial executions, constitute willful killing, and willful killing is considered to be a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions. Grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions can be punished as war crimes under the U.S. War Crimes Act. Now, just days after the September 11th attacks, Congress authorized the use of force against groups and countries that had supported terrorist attacks against the United States, past tense, that had supported terrorist attacks, in what was called the Authorization for the Use of Military Force. Bush had asked for more authority. He wanted an open-ended authority to deter and preempt any future acts of terrorism or aggression against the United States, but Congress turned him down. And in the Military Appropriations Act of 2012, Congress made very clear that nothing in this section is intended to expand the authority of the President or the scope of the authorization of military force that Congress had given to Bush after 9/11. Now, the CIA's drone campaign has killed dozens of civilians who had gone to rescue victims or who were attending funerals. And there's a new report just released by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism that says that since Obama took office 3 years ago, as many as 535 civilians have been killed, more than 60 of them children. At least 50 civilians were killed in follow-up strikes when they had gone to help victims. More than 20 civilians have also been attacked in deliberate strikes on funerals and mourners. These are all violations of the Geneva Conventions.
And so now, when we hear about drone strikes, we are not hearing any longer about extrajudicial killings or even the presumed guilt of the people. All we hear about is that there has been another drone strike and this many suspected militants have been killed. So the technology has overshadowed the nature of the act itself, the crime, I would say.
I am comfortable with it. I'm more than comfortable. I'm extremely happy and surprised, actually, with the way that these weapon systems have been used by the current administration.
And yet, we're working on this other thing, playing with making Predator missiles and so forth, which are a terrorist type of a weapon. This strikes terror. Like, think about it. If you're living here, and at any time you could have a silent Predator drone coming over, dropping a missile on you or something, or a bomb, or just looking at what you're doing. It's terrorism. It strikes terror, you know, the shock and awe and the terrorism that they talked about. If you lived in a community where you were subject to the United States, the will of the United States to get in there, then you are in terror all the time of what's going to happen next. Am I going to be killed by one of these drones? A lot of collateral damage has gone on from that.
So I would strongly advise people not to be psychologically overwhelmed by the drones and believe that they're all powerful, all omniscient, out of some science fiction program that your child is watching. It's not true. They need operatives on the ground, and they antagonize populations on the ground. They cannot win the war in Pakistan or Afghanistan because the war is unpopular with the people in those countries. They can inflict a lot of blood. They can create a lot of headlines. They can notch a lot of wins from a public relations standpoint, but they postpone the day of reckoning, I'm afraid, and make it harder to realize a resolution because they inflame so many millions of people in these countries.
So what we're seeing is a very, very indiscriminate process where the people who are being killed are just not the people that the CIA says they're killing. Best example of that was while I was in Pakistan. There were 2 strikes. The first one, the CIA said, killed 6 militants. Well, it didn't. It killed 4 chromite miners, and they were just wrong. The second one was far more personal for me, and frankly has turned this from a legal human rights issue into something that I see very personally. One of the children who came to the meeting we had in Islamabad was a kid called Tariq Aziz, who was 16 years old. Now, 3 days after I met him personally, he was hit by a CIA missile that killed him and his 12-year-old cousin Wahid. These people were no more terrorists than my grandmother, and yet the CIA announced to the world that 4 militants had been killed. It wasn't 4 militants, it was 2 children. And there's only one way that could have happened, and that's because one of our informants, one of the people we pay in Pakistan, attached a GPS tracker to their car and then announced to their paymasters that these guys were terrorists, and it's just not true. And what we're seeing here, unfortunately, is what happens when you hand out money in a country where there isn't much money. People in that part of Pakistan would sell their own parents for the sort of money the CIA is paying, and unfortunately, the CIA is naive enough to think that this is genuine intelligence, and the consequences are tragic.
And then they say, on the one hand, since 2006, there have been over 2,000 so-called leaders, so-called operatives of the Taliban, and, quote, allied extremist groups killed, and only 138 civilians, quote unquote. The CIA goes farther and says no civilians have been killed since 2008, which I don't know anyone besides the CIA who believes it. But most of these drone strikes have been in, particularly in North Waziristan, 89% of them in North Waziristan since 2010. That's the time period when the peace talks secretly began with the Taliban and Pakistan. I guess the Pentagon view is the more you beat up people with drone attacks, the more they'll be compliant at the negotiating table. I would say some hearings need to be held on that question, because I think the more you make people hate you and distrust you with your secret drone attacks, the less likely they are to believe you when you're trying to negotiate a peace settlement with them.
The military has, regarding Afghanistan, their point of view is rather clear. They want to eliminate the Pakistani Taliban, but they see the Afghani Taliban as being an asset. The reason is simple, because they see India, the increasing encroachment by India, and they feel that they are losing, that they are being encircled. And so there's a large Indian presence in Afghanistan, and India is investing a lot. So, and the US has, at the same time, has been giving nuclear technology to India, and is developing closer relations there. So as a result, Pakistan feels that if not the Taliban in Afghanistan, so then they have no other friendly faction inside. So that's why it's in their interest to shore up the Afghani Taliban. So what they do is that in order for their own self-preservation, they feel that they have to support the Taliban, because in a post occupation Afghanistan, they would need some kind of a friendly force on their northern border. So for that reason, they are never going to abandon the Afghani Taliban. It's a matter of strategic interest for them. So that's why they have always made this distinction between the Afghani Taliban and the Pakistani Taliban. So they see the Afghani Taliban as the good Taliban and the Pakistani Taliban as the bad ones. So they fight one, and then at the same time they encourage the other.
The number of Taliban and Al-Qaeda leaders killed in these areas, and this is in the period of the last 6 years, has been totally insignificant. It's not 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. The so-called leaders, like bin Laden, 10 in the Haqqani network, 7 in the Bahadur network, 7 in the Masood network, 1 in the Hekmatyar network. That's such a small number of so-called leaders. You wonder how difficult it is for them to be replaced, and you wonder at the elasticity of the broader definition of leaders and operatives that goes into these bigger numbers.
But I am certain of one thing: we are at war. We are at war against a terrorist organization called Al-Qaeda that has brutally murdered thousands of Americans, men, women, and children, as well as thousands of other innocent people around the world.
The fact of the matter is, it's hard to imagine any war being won without a presence on the ground. Wars are not won from the air, unless they're public relations wars. They're not won from the air. You have to have a constituency. You have to have a client. You have to have a partner. You have to have a mass base on the ground. The truth is that the drone wars are a way to keep what our government is doing secret from the American people. They're not a secret from people in Pakistan. There are endless rallies against the drones in Pakistan. The attacks antagonize people in Pakistan. They infuriate, they inflame, and we've already had attempted attacks on the United States, terrorist attacks, by people who said they were motivated by the hatred of the drones. So it's not even true that the drone keeps us safe. The drone provokes people to hate us to the extent where they want to turn themselves and the airplane they're in into a guided missile aimed at Times Square in New York or Detroit Metropolitan Airport, where I'm from. So it's the latest mystification of technology, as if there's a technological solution. We somehow have to have wars without spilling American blood and without Americans knowing. And I think it's like a boomerang that will just come around and hit us hard.
The whole thing is secret, and this is what's shocking about it. The CIA is waging a war that it won't even admit it's doing against Pakistan, which is meant to be our ally. What astounds me at this level is back when we bombed Cambodia, when President Nixon bombed Cambodia, there was a huge outrage. It was secret to begin with, it was illegal, but then there was an outrage. Now what's going on now is equally outrageous. It's causing equal carnage, and yet no one is talking about it.
Well, if you read Bob Woodward's last book, which is all about the deliberations around the Pakistan-Afghanistan policy, so the picture that emerges is that Obama is rather clueless when it comes to the situation in Afghanistan, and he's caught between these different contending parties within his administration of advisors, and they have different agendas, and he's been going through them one by one, trying them out. And it's the policies being made at a very ad hoc basis, and a lot of it has the concerns are very domestic. It's not so much about things out there, it's rather about how things are perceived at home.
The Jonas Brothers are here. They're out there somewhere. Sasha and Malia are huge fans, but boys don't get any ideas. I have 2 words for you. Predator drones. You will never see it coming. You think I'm joking?